So I'm actually going to share this right now, so that it's on this recording. I who shall not be with name hereby proclaim to all with unclean hands. Be it now known that all words and spellings upon within this document shall be of my will and intent only, without assumption, presumption, on, of, by, for, any, all concerned, where my free will choice shall never be trespassed, where my intent is my intent and no others. Whereas a great fraud has been revealed and is laid bare, where unclean hands are now in the light for all to see, where any, all, with unclean hands must judge only self, toto generi, in full character. Whereas non-disclosure has intent to defraud in that act, any, all contracts of body, mind, soul are null and void, nunc pro tunc, praeterea, 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 ab initio ad infinitum, in this willful intent to commit fraud by omission and or commission where others and all are concerned. And whereas threat of force perceived or real is proof of intent inasmuch as aiding and abetting in this fraud, and where assumption and presumption is concerned, thus destroyed, and whereby one is known by their actions of that their willful intent, either knowingly or in ignorance of the divine laws under which all stand, and whereas all signatures, contracts, assumptions, presumptions, etc. at all are rendered null and void ab initio, inasmuch as all are in contempt fraud, where the Crown owned and copyright names, and I listed out myself and the ones that were stuck to me and those that I had contract with, my daughter's ex-wife, Sue, parents, you name it, where those names are concerned, and whereas the intent to commit fraud via deception, deceptios, and willful non-disclosure of truth, where intent to enslave all humanity, mankind, by church-state in this intent is exposed fully, whereby one's actions make one known, and whereas all names registered are in fact property of the Crown Vatican, all matters pertaining to such names registered and the use thereof render all parties fraudulent in contempt via willful intent to deceive, and or ignorance of use, where all matters of church-state remain matters of church-state, where use of the names registered are concerned, and where, when third-party interlopement is evident by my use or anyone's use of stated registered names. And whereas it is not my intent to commit fraud or any contempt-able acts, it is also my equal intent to never aid and abet any other living soul via willfully knowing or ignorance on or in their my parts. Any use of or claim made using the aforementioned names will render such attempt an act of fraud by willful commission. And whereas all use of church-state identification based upon these all Crown copyright names or any variations thereof renders the user in fraud absolute via their ignorance and by omission of disclosure of by church-state. So it's a combination. Both are guilty, you and them. And whereas any all claims made by any all parties, agents, living souls upon another, willfully or in ignorance, to do so is guilty of fraud in that action by commission and or omission of bearing false witness, and is in contempt of church-state self, and is willfully aiding and abetting fraudulent deception or deceptios, whereupon judgment is rendered upon any and all agents of church-state and self by the very action of claiming via Crown copyright fraud. And inasmuch as intent, spirit, must be proven where all are concerned, it is now incumbent upon the church-state that the willful intent to commit fraud ab initio is without intent to do so. With prior knowledge, the agents, clergy, bar members, all bound by oaths, etc. at all, to, of, for, by, with church-state, do willfully deceive humanity, and is, by the actions of all bound to church-state by oaths, sworn, taken, given, judged by, of, in, all acts of harm upon any and all harmed. And whereas fraudulent intent of all bound to church-state entities, living souls, principalities, is visible via omission and or commission by the actions of harm intent to harm of, for, by all beings, using a name in fraud ab initio, all claims made, coerced, assumed, presumed, etc., at all are in fact fraudulent at source of, for, by, all claiming any and all legal names. That's both sides. You use a name and you try to get me to use one, well, you're committing fraud first and trying to aid and abet me into your game. Sorry, I don't play that, homie. So the fictional identities, titles, etc., at all and or thus any all forms, aliases, and are of, by, for the criminal intent to do so, using the intellectual property of another living soul, spirit, or dead fictional entity, where I am toto generi, spirit, mind, body. And, by the way, these are not easy to write, okay? So I'm kind of hoping that people just don't, blow past this stuff. This is countless hours put into these things. Lifetime of research, by the way, all right, and experience. Furthermore, to engage in such intently destructive acts of harm, deception, theft, coercion, etc. at all against another via any and all means is shown by one's actions, and need never be judged, whereby the act is the judge in and of itself. Judge not lest ye be judged, where assumption, presumption cannot, does not, and will not exist after the act itself. And furthermore, any all registration, registering, register by omission and or commission, where full disclosure is not evident, the intent of church state, any all claiming such association, joinder by means of willful oaths, signatures, cursive, titles, etc., et al. Are in fact willful acts of predetermined fraud, knowingly or unknowingly, where wrongful obligations, curses, has, is, and was the intent, where obligations are replaced back upon those who knowingly and or in ignorance of their fraud to do so ab initio ad infinitum, nunc pro tunc, praeterea, praeterea, praeterea. What that basically says is that, where was it? Because there was no full disclosure evident, doesn't make the one committing that crime innocent. There's that little tricky bastard called ignorance, and there is no defense in ignorance. It's one of their major rules, probably the biggest one of all. Furthermore, was never my intent to willfully use the property of another, whereas any all things registered are in fact claimed to be such intellectual property of another, namely church, state, crown, where my mother and father, deceased, unknowingly were, in ignorance, aided and abetted of their consent into such church, state contracts, be they all forms, physical, physical, spiritual, mental, and, furthermore, I place the onus back upon return to any, all beings by virtue of their oaths, etc., and self-judged in their acts, any all obligations created by any all contracts, where all contracts entered into based on this fraud, original sin, intent to defraud, are nullified, null and void, ab initio ad infinitum, nunc pro tunc. And furthermore, all obligations upon myself created via this fraud are void, inasmuch as a perceived, assumed, presumed gift without consideration of any all names is concerned in that a bond debt was, is, and has been created in the form of a birth certificate with an assigned debt, not value, where I was assumed, presumed to be that value without or void of my willful consent, where it was and is, has been the willful intent of by for all parties initiating such acts of obligation upon this, their debt. Whereas intent is clearly visible by any all who engage in acts of commerce, whore of Babylon, using the name, mark of the beast, is, was, has been, will be acting in fraud and creating harm, cannibalism against their fellow humans, beings, since all fiat currency is based upon aforementioned bonds and is guilty of human being trafficking of the highest order and in defiance of creation where consumption ensues. And whereas the willful intent of from any all willful associates, members, oath beings of church, state, crown, is evidentiary proof of by for any all acts perpetuated against another, where any and all registered names are concerned, inasmuch as non-disclosure by aforementioned was never given, offered, where aiding and abetting in fraud is the intent, and where any and all aforementioned have unclean hands accordingly. And, whereas any and all registered things, possessions are in fact property of the church, court, state, crown, copyright, where any claim made by any and all, not oath to the aforementioned, are matters of church, court, state, crown, inasmuch as willful trespass and enticement into slavery via third-party interloping into such matters that do not concern me, the one who shall not be of name, where my own customary calling is mine, and shall never be given. This was a kind of a key one here, so let me just get this. Okay, if you're not part of the club, right, you're not given the right to use it. That's what lawyers get. They get right to use these copyrights, including their own name. So that's what keeps them in honor. That's why only they can talk in the courts for the judges, because they're the only ones that are allowed to use that crown copyright name. They were given permission. You never were. That's been the trick all along. That's what separates the bar from us, right? That one, I got wind of that through a friend in Texas who was in contact with two very high-level lawyers, and they actually came up to him one day and said, "How the hell are you guys figuring this stuff out? You're scaring the shit out of us." And it came back through a City of London lawyer as well that was in cohorts with these guys. So I had some pretty cool inside information that walked me on my trail. These are my experiences, though. Bet you didn't know that, though. Here we go. Furthermore, by means of this birth certificate, long form, short form, deception, non-disclosure, willful act of fraud, the only documents ever willfully given as proof of intent to commit fraud, aid and abet fraud by, of, for, church, court, state, crown, etc., at all, and all oath bonded to willfully such titles, fictions, corporations, where the claim is also made that the aforementioned take on the role of perceived parens patria, embodiment of state, and are in fact kidnapped, abused, harmed any all who have been fraudulently claimed to be a ward of admiralty, where the mother is fiduciary and father is beneficiary ab initio, and whereas the rights of both mother and father have been stolen via non-disclosure and willful intent, as proved by actions of those by oath willful applications, any all claiming to be of, for, by, church, court, state, crown, in the form of birth certificates, licenses, marriages, family names, taxes, registrations, etc., at all ab initio. Therefore, is it your willful intent of this? I've got a few of them here. I'll keep it simple. Is it the willful intent of this court at all to have me incriminate myself, where I am in full knowledge of this dual fraud, where willful intent to do so makes me and you guilty ab initio by claiming to own or be something that is and was and has never been mine or yours to be or claim? What that's saying is, you're asking the court, is it your willful intent to aid and abet me into committing a crime I do not wish to commit? Because here's the thing, if you're there, this is why they run, because they stand the chance of they're as guilty as you are. That's the joy of this. This makes both parties guilty, and you're the one fessing up to it, because you know that there was fraud before this. And is it your by oath entity, whatever it is, the judge or whatever, is it your intent to aid and abet the furtherance of this fraud, or cannibalism, child kidnapping, human trafficking, theft, etc., at all via the fictitious acts legislation, etc., at all, by, of, for dead entities, by, for, of dead entities, dead carrying out the dead? That's basically both parties I wanted to make sure were named, where I am the one of the living versus a fictional dead entity created by, of, for the church, court, state, crown by enticing me via force, coercion, deception to be a surety for the church, state, crown, court-created debts? What are you saying? Are you trying to aid and abet me into claiming to be something as a surety for this fraud so that you can benefit? Are you kidding me? Seriously? Do you think I'm going to fall for that shit? All right. Well, we all did, right? Whereas any all fraud by virtue of its intent and creation remains as such, regardless of length of time taken for such and any all frauds to be exposed. All contracts are null and void upon its discovery, where a fraud revealed is, in fact, null and void ab initio nunc pro tunc, where all energy stolen in any all forms shall be returned, where the intent to commit fraud against me has been and will be with intent. See, here's the thing about fraud. There is no statute of limitations on fraud. They couldn't. Not even in their own rules. There is no limitation. No statute of limitation of fraud. It is not, has never been, never will be my intent to willfully and knowingly commit fraud, where mistakes and ignorance by commission and or omission are present, and where any all acts of mine are not in contempt with temptation of anyone, anything, where any being choosing willfully to contempt me is now with intent to do so. This is where you turn contempt of court back on its head. You make them in contempt of their own courts. All contracts, documents, signatures, agreements, etc. at all are now null and void, where any and all debt created by church, state, court, crown is forgiven, returned from whence it was created. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Where I am the non-contracting living with the debt bond, id entity, that is the property and responsibility of that or those which created it. You create the debt, you fucking pay it, I'm done. It is furthermore the obligation of any all oath beings of, by, for the church, state, court, crown to return my energy. Here's the clincher, right? Yeah, you can say that you don't own any property, but there's a little matter of the energy that you were deceived out of that kind of has to be replaced. There's your creation coming back for you. So to return my energy, creation's life force stolen via this original sin intent to defraud my mother and father, where they aided and abetted in my own fraud by means of deception, non-disclosure, where your unclean hands have been concerned. I seek no vengeance, I offer no judgments, and return the obligations of debt's forgiveness to those who would have deceived me, where a crime against all humanity has been and is being perpetrated with willful intent in the light for all to see. by one's actions, one is known, and instantly judged in of, for, by such actions, where the intent is laid bare for all to see, in of, by, for any, all such actions, whereas all, any beings willfully by, for, of commission, omission are held and bound judged of themselves. Act accordingly, lest ye be judged, in of, for, by oneself, yourself fully, toto genre. There it is. That's you sticking it right back up their ass. That's where it needs to be. At all are rendered null and void ab initio, inasmuch as all are in contempt fraud, where the Crown owned and copyright names, and I listed out myself and the ones that were stuck to me and those that I had contract with, my daughters, ex-wife, Sue, parents, you name it. Whereas threat of force perceived or real is proof of intent inasmuch as aiding and abetting in this fraud, and where assumption and presumption is concerned, thus destroyed, and whereby one is known by their actions of that their willful intent, either knowingly or in ignorance of the divine laws under which all stand, and whereas all signatures, contracts, assumptions, presumptions, etc. genre in full character. Whereas non-disclosure has intent to defraud in that act, any all contracts of body, mind, soul are null and void, nunc pro tunc, praeterea, 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 ab initio ad infinitum, in this willful intent to commit fraud by omission and or commission where others and all are concerned. And where so I'm actually going to share this right now, so that it's on this recording. I who shall not be with name hereby proclaim to all with unclean hands. Be it now known that all words and spellings upon within this document shall be of my will and intent only, without assumption, presumption, on, of, by, for, any, all concerned, where my free will choice shall never be trespassed, where my intent is my intent and no others. Whereas a great fraud has been revealed and is laid bare, where unclean hands are now in the light for all to see, where any, all, with unclean hands must judge only self, toto